Hi, I'm Sally A Illingworth and I'm excited to be here today with Dr. Nair and